For over 3,000 years, Egypt rose, fell, and reshaped itself again and again, long before Rome, long before Greece, long before the modern world. This is not just a story of pyramids and pharaohs. It is the story of how a civilization was born from the Nile, how kings became gods, how power expanded into empire, and how belief itself was once rewritten. From the first villages before the pharaohs, through the age of pyramids, collapse, reunification, foreign rule, and global power, Egypt's history is a slow human journey of survival and adaptation. This documentary follows the entire arc, from 3100 BC to 30 BC, to understand not just how Egypt ruled, but how it endured. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Civilization. Long before pyramids, before carved temples, before the word Pharaoh meant anything at all, the land that would become Egypt was already alive with quiet movement. Around 7000 to 5000 BC, small groups of people began settling along the banks of the Nile. They were not building empires. They were farming, fishing, herding animals, and learning the rhythm of a river that flooded, retreated, and returned with steady patience. This was the true beginning of Egypt, long before kings or crowns. The Nile did something rare. Each year, it flooded in a predictable way, leaving behind dark, fertile soil. This made farming easier than in many other regions. Over time, people stopped moving from place to place. Villages formed. Storage pits appeared. Pottery styles became more refined. Graves began to show care and intention, with the dead buried alongside tools, beads, and food. These details matter because there are no long-written stories from this time. What survives are objects. And those objects tell us that these early communities were already thinking about life, death, and order. By around 4000 BC, Egypt was not one land, but many. Archaeologists usually describe two main cultural regions. In the south, along the narrow Nile Valley, communities developed what we now call Upper Egypt. In the north, where the river spreads into wide marshes, Lower Egypt took shape. These regions were different. Their pottery looked different. Their burial customs were not the same. Even their symbols and animals carried different meanings. This tells us that Egypt did not begin as a single idea. It began as a patchwork. Over generations, these small societies grew more complex. Villages turned into towns. Leaders emerged, likely at first as organizers of food, water, and labor, rather than absolute rulers. Graves from this period start to show inequality. Some people were buried with more goods, better materials, and larger tombs. This is one of the clearest signs that social hierarchy was forming. Power was no longer evenly shared. What is striking is how early belief systems appear alongside this growing structure. Even in these early graves, bodies are often placed in a curled position, facing a specific direction, usually toward the west, where the sun set. This suggests ideas about death and renewal were already taking root. Religion did not arrive later to explain power. It grew alongside it. By around 3300 BC, something begins to change more quickly. Art becomes more symbolic. Animal figures, boats, and standards appear on carved palettes and ceremonial objects. These images are not decoration alone. Many scholars believe they represent clans, regions, or early political groups. Some scenes show conflict, others show processions or offerings. Together, they hint that competition between regions was increasing. This is where the unification mystery begins. Traditional Egyptian history, written much later, tells a simple story. A single ruler united Upper and Lower Egypt and founded the first dynasty around 3100 BC. In later king lists, that ruler is often called Nama or Menes. But archaeology does not give us a clean moment. There is no single inscription that says, Egypt is now one. Instead, there are fragments. One of the most important objects from this time is a carved stone palette showing a king wearing different crowns on each side. The imagery suggests dominance over both regions, but whether this represents one man, several generations, or a symbolic claim is still debated. What seems more likely is that unification was a process, not an event. Alliances, marriages, conflicts, and shared beliefs slowly pulled the regions together. What we can say with confidence is that by 3100 BC, Egypt was no longer a collection of villages. It had become a state. There was a central authority, early writing used for record-keeping, and shared religious ideas that tied the land together. The people living through this moment likely did not realize they were standing at the start of a civilization that would last for thousands of years. This early world is hard to see clearly, not because it was simple, but because it was quiet. Its story is written in clay, stone, and soil, not in long texts. In the next part, the focus will move closer to the first kings themselves, and how power, belief, and symbols began to merge into something entirely new. Chapter 2. Kings, Gods, and the First Dynasties. By the time Egypt entered what we now call the early dynastic period, around 3100 BC, power had begun to take on a new shape. Leadership was no longer just about managing land or organizing food. It was becoming sacred. The ruler of Egypt was no longer seen as simply the strongest leader or the head of a powerful family. He was presented as something more, a living bridge between the human world and the divine one. This idea did not appear fully formed overnight. It grew alongside the state itself. As Egypt unified, people needed a shared explanation for why one person stood above all others. Religion provided that explanation. The king was not only chosen by the gods, he was part of the cosmic order that kept the world stable. Floods came on time. Crops grew. Chaos stayed outside the borders. As long as the king ruled correctly, the universe itself stayed balanced. Most of what we know about these first dynasties comes not from written histories, but from the dead. Royal tombs from this period, especially those at Abydos and Saqqara, are large, carefully planned, and surrounded by subsidiary burials. These graves tell a story of power, but also raise difficult questions. Some of the people buried near early kings may have been servants or officials who died at the same time. Whether this was voluntary, ritual, or forced is still debated. What is clear is that death had become a stage for expressing authority. Inside these tombs, archaeologists find objects meant to last forever: stone vessels, finely carved ivory, ceremonial palettes, and early inscriptions. These items were not everyday tools. They were symbols. They showed control over resources, skilled labor, and long-distance trade. Even at this early stage, Egypt was already connected to regions far beyond the Nile Valley, importing materials like copper, cedar wood, and precious stones. Alongside royal power, institutions began to form. There is evidence for early taxation systems, likely based on grain and livestock. Seal impressions suggest the movement of goods was recorded and controlled. This means scribes already existed, even if their names are lost. Administration was becoming part of daily life, though probably unevenly applied across the land. One of the most puzzling features of this period is writing itself. Hieroglyphs appear suddenly, already complex and symbolic. They are used to label ownership, mark royal names, and connect the king with gods and rituals. What we do not see are earlier drafts or clear stages of development. This has led historians to suspect that writing evolved on perishable materials like wood or papyrus that did not survive. If so, entire centuries of experimentation may be missing from the archaeological record. Writing at this stage was not used to tell stories or record events in detail. It was a tool of power. Names mattered more than sentences. Symbols mattered more than explanation. To write a king's name was to fix his authority in time. This is why royal titles became so important. The king was associated with specific gods, animals, and cosmic roles. These titles helped unify belief across different regions. Still, Egypt was not yet a tightly controlled empire. Power likely varied from place to place. Local leaders probably retained influence, especially far from the royal centers. The image of a perfectly centralized state comes mostly from later periods, when Egyptians looked back and simplified their own past. The reality was likely messier, with negotiation, compromise, and gradual change. By the end of the early dynastic period, the foundations were set. Kingship was divine. Administration existed. Writing had taken root. But many details remain hidden, buried beneath layers of later history. In the next part, we will look more closely at how these early systems tried to hold the country together, and where the first cracks may already have been forming. Chapter 3. The Pyramid Age and the Problem of Power. By the time the Old Kingdom began, around 2686 BC, Egypt had entered what looks, at first glance, like an age of complete control. Kings ruled from a fixed center. Officials answered to the crown. Resources flowed toward royal projects on a scale never seen before. And rising above the desert edges of the Nile Valley, massive stone pyramids began to appear. To later generations, these structures seemed like proof that the system worked perfectly. But the truth, hidden beneath the stone, is far more delicate. The Pyramid Age did not begin suddenly. It grew out of earlier royal tombs, which had already become larger and more complex over time. At first, kings were buried in flat-topped mastabas made of mud brick. Then came a bold shift. Instead of expanding outward, royal tombs began to rise upward. Stone replaced brick. Shape replaced sprawl. This was not just architectural ambition. It was a statement. The king's power was meant to be seen from miles away, fixed in the landscape like the sun itself. Building pyramids required more than belief. It required planning on a national scale. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and set with precision. Food had to be produced in surplus to feed thousands of workers. Tools had to be made and replaced constantly. Recent discoveries near pyramid sites show organized workers' villages, bakeries, storage rooms, and medical tools. These finds challenge the old idea that pyramids were built by enslaved people driven by force. Instead, evidence points to a labor system tied closely to agriculture. During the annual Nile flood, when fields were underwater and farming paused, large numbers of workers could be redirected to state projects. Many were likely paid in food, housing, and status. Inscriptions left by work gangs even show pride, with team names that suggest identity and competition rather than punishment. This does not mean the work was easy. It was exhausting and dangerous, but it appears to have been part of a broader social contract between the state and its people. At the center of this system stood the king. Old Kingdom rulers were presented as divine beings, not only chosen by the gods, but embodying them. The success of the harvest, the flooding of the Nile, and the stability of the land were all linked to the king's role in maintaining cosmic balance. Pyramid texts, some of the earliest religious writings in Egypt, describe the king ascending to the sky, joining the gods, and continuing to protect the land after death. The pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a machine of belief. Yet even as pyramids grew larger and more refined, subtle changes were taking place beneath the surface. Administrative records show an expanding bureaucracy. Officials gained titles, land grants, and regional authority. Tombs of non-royal elites became more elaborate, decorated with scenes of daily life and personal achievement. This suggests that power, once tightly held, was beginning to spread outward. There are also signs of environmental stress. Climate data from surrounding regions indicates periods of reduced rainfall toward the end of the Old Kingdom. Even small changes in the Nile's flooding could have serious consequences. Less water meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant less surplus. And without surplus, the system that supported massive royal projects began to strain. What makes the Old Kingdom so important is not just what it built, but what it reveals. The pyramids stand as symbols of unity and control, but they also expose how much effort it took to keep that control intact. Every stone depended on belief, organization, and resources aligning at the same time. When those elements began to shift, the system quietly weakened. In the next part, the focus will move away from the construction sites and toward the growing pressures inside the state itself, where loyalty, resources, and authority were no longer as firmly balanced as they once seemed. Chapter 4. Collapse without invasion. The collapse of the Old Kingdom did not arrive with armies at the border or fires in the capital. There was no single invasion, no dramatic overthrow recorded in stone. Instead, Egypt's first great breakdown unfolded quietly, over decades, as systems that once worked began to fail from within. By around 2180 BC, the authority of the king had weakened so much that he could no longer hold the country together. What followed is known as the First Intermediate Period, and understanding it is far more difficult than naming it. One reason is silence. Monument buildings slowed, then stopped. Royal inscriptions became rare. Whole regions seemed to drop out of the archaeological record for generations. For a civilization that loved recording order and permanence, this absence speaks loudly. It suggests not instant collapse, but a slow loss of coordination. The center no longer commanded the edges, and the edges no longer looked to the center. Later Egyptian writers described this time as chaos. In texts written centuries afterward, the period is portrayed as one where the poor became rich, tombs were robbed, and violence ruled the land. These writings are powerful, emotional, and moralistic. They warn of what happens when kings fail in their duty. But they are not neutral histories. They were written with purpose, often to praise later rulers by contrasting them with a dark past. Modern historians have to be careful. When we look beyond these moral stories and focus on archaeology, a more complex picture emerges. Central authority clearly weakened, but life did not simply stop. In many regions, local leaders stepped in. They controlled land, collected resources, and built their own tombs. These tombs often show strong local styles, different from the royal art of earlier periods. This tells us that power did not disappear. It shifted. One major question is climate. Evidence from nearby regions suggests periods of drought around the end of the Old Kingdom. If the Nile failed to flood properly for several years in a row, the consequences would have been severe. Harvests would shrink. Food storage would empty. The state, which depended on surplus to function, would struggle to support officials, workers, and religious institutions. Even a strong system can crack under repeated environmental stress. At the same time, economic inequality had been growing for generations. Powerful officials had gained land and wealth, often passed down through families. Their loyalty to the king may have weakened as their local influence grew. When resources became scarce, these officials may have chosen to protect their own regions first. This kind of fragmentation does not require rebellion. It happens when cooperation no longer feels beneficial. Another challenge comes from the uneven nature of the collapse. Some areas show clear signs of decline, while others continue to thrive. This suggests that Egypt did not fall apart all at once. Different regions experienced the breakdown differently. This is one reason why artistic styles, burial customs, and religious practices begin to vary more widely during this period. Without a strong center enforcing unity, diversity expanded. What makes this collapse so important is that it forced Egyptians to reflect on power itself. The idea that the king alone guaranteed order no longer seemed absolute. Later generations looked back on this time with fear, but also with lessons. They asked why balance had failed and how it could be restored. In the next part, we will move closer to the people who lived through this transition and explore how local rule, new identities, and survival reshaped Egypt during its first dark age. Chapter 5: Reunification and the Rise of the Middle Kingdom. When Egypt began to reunite around 2050 BC, it did not feel like a return to the past. The memory of collapse was still fresh. The long years of fragmentation had left scars on the land, on local power structures, and on how people thought about kingship itself. The rulers who emerged to restore unity understood this. They did not present themselves simply as distant gods on earth. Instead, they framed their rule as a response to failure, almost as a promise that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The reunification is usually linked to rulers from Thebes, a city in Upper Egypt that had grown in strength during the First Intermediate Period. Through a mix of military pressure, alliances, and careful administration, they managed to bring rival regions back under a single crown. But this was not the sudden conquest seen in later empires. It was gradual, negotiated, and deeply shaped by lessons learned during the breakdown of central power. Once unity was restored, the new rulers faced a critical task: rebuilding trust. The Old Kingdom model, where everything flowed upward toward the king, had proven fragile. In the Middle Kingdom, administration became more balanced. Officials were still powerful, but their roles were more clearly defined and supervised. Records show careful tracking of land, grain, and labor. This was not just control for its own sake. It was an attempt to prevent the unchecked accumulation of power that had helped weaken the state before. Irrigation projects expanded during this period, especially in regions that had suffered during years of low flooding. Canals were dug, water was redirected, and agricultural land increased. These efforts required coordination between local communities and the central government. In many ways, water management became a shared responsibility, binding people more closely to the state. Survival and loyalty were no longer abstract ideas. They were tied to real, visible improvements in daily life. What makes the Middle Kingdom especially important is how openly it reflected on disorder. For the first time, Egyptian texts speak directly about chaos, injustice, and fear of social collapse. Stories and instructions from this era describe a world where moral balance matters as much as ritual. Kings are portrayed as shepherds of the people, responsible for protecting the weak and ensuring fairness. This shift in tone suggests that rulers understood legitimacy had to be earned, not just inherited. These literary works are rare windows into how Egyptians thought about their society. They describe hunger, displacement, and anxiety, but also hope that order can be restored through right action. At the same time, they serve political purposes. By emphasizing the dangers of disorder, they reinforce loyalty to the state. Stability becomes a shared goal, not just a royal achievement. Still, historians debate how deeply these reforms reached. Tombs of elites continue to show wealth and comfort, while evidence from ordinary settlements is more uneven. Some regions flourished, while others remained vulnerable to poor harvests and local power struggles. This raises an important question. Was the Middle Kingdom truly a golden age for everyone, or mainly for those closest to power? What seems clear is that Egypt had changed. Kingship was no longer only about divine distance. It was about memory, responsibility, and balance. The state had learned from collapse, and that memory shaped every decision moving forward. In the next part, we will look more closely at how these reforms played out in everyday life, and where signs of tension still lingered beneath the surface. Chapter 6. Foreign Rule and Cultural Survival. By the time Egypt entered the Second Intermediate Period, around 1650 BC, the sense of balance created during the Middle Kingdom had begun to slip. Once again, central authority weakened, and the country fractured into regions ruled by different powers. But this time, the change felt different. Foreign names appeared in king lists, new weapons showed up in the archaeological record, and later Egyptian writers would remember this era not just as disorder, but as occupation. The group most closely associated with this period are the Hyksos, a term later Egyptians used to describe foreign rulers based in the Nile Delta. For a long time, they were portrayed as violent invaders who stormed into Egypt and seized power by force. Ancient texts written centuries later describe them as outsiders who brought chaos and humiliation. But archaeology tells a quieter, more complicated story. There is little evidence of widespread destruction at the start of Hyksos rule. Instead, what appears is gradual change. Settlements in the Delta show growing connections with the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Trade goods increase. Pottery styles shift. Burial customs mix local and foreign traditions. This suggests that many of these foreign rulers may have arrived over time, as merchants, settlers, or local leaders with outside roots, rather than as conquerors. One of the clearest changes from this period is military technology. Weapons, such as composite bows and new types of daggers, appear more frequently. Fortifications become more common, especially in border regions. These developments likely reflected a more connected and competitive world, not just foreign aggression. Egypt was no longer isolated. It was part of a wider network of trade and conflict stretching far beyond the Nile. Despite later claims, Egyptian culture did not vanish during this time. Temples continued to function. Local officials still managed land and labor. Egyptian language, religious practices, and art styles persisted, especially in Upper Egypt. This suggests that daily life for most people may not have changed as dramatically as later stories imply. The presence of foreign rulers at the top did not erase local traditions on the ground. What did change was how power was divided. Egypt was no longer unified under a single ruler. Instead, different dynasties controlled different regions. The Hyksos ruled in the north, while Egyptian kings held power in the south. This division created tension, but also competition. Southern rulers began to adopt and improve upon the very military technologies associated with their rivals. Over time, this would shift the balance of power. The way later Egyptians remembered this period tells us as much about the future as it does about the past. When Egypt eventually reunited, new rulers emphasized the idea of liberation. They framed the defeat of the Hyksos as a national victory and used it to justify stronger armies and expanded borders. In this version of history, foreign rule became a warning, a reminder of what happens when Egypt grows weak. Modern historians approach this narrative with caution. Because most written sources come from after the fact, they reflect political goals as much as memory. The truth likely lies between extremes. The Hyksos were neither harmless guests nor purely destructive invaders. They were part of a changing world where movement, trade, and cultural exchange blurred old boundaries. What makes this period so important is not just the presence of foreign rulers, but how Egypt responded. Instead of disappearing, Egyptian culture absorbed new ideas, adapted, and endured. In the next part, we will look at how this period of division set the stage for a powerful comeback, and how Egypt turned survival into renewed strength. Chapter 7. Empire, War, and Global Power. When Egypt emerged from the shadow of foreign rule and internal division, it did not turn inward to heal quietly. Instead, it looked outward with new confidence and sharp intent. Around 1550 BC, The beginning of the new kingdom marked a clear shift in how Egypt saw itself. No longer just a land defending its borders, Egypt became a power that pushed beyond them. This was the age when war, diplomacy, and empire became part of everyday governance. The rulers who founded the new kingdom had learned hard lessons from the past. The experience of division and foreign dominance had changed their priorities. Security could no longer rely on geography alone. Deserts and seas were not enough. To stay safe, Egypt believed it had to control what lay beyond its borders. This idea reshaped everything, from the army to the economy, from royal identity to foreign policy. Military campaigns became more frequent and more organized. Inscriptions carved on temple walls describe marches into Nubia to the south and into the Levant to the north. These records were not neutral reports. They were carefully crafted messages meant to show strength, order, and divine support. Kings were shown towering over enemies, guided by gods, striking down chaos wherever it appeared. War was presented not as violence, but as a sacred duty. Yet behind these images was a real and complex system. Armies needed supplies, training, and leadership. Fortresses were built along borders and trade routes. Garrisons were stationed far from the Nile Valley, sometimes for years at a time. This required constant flow of resources, food, weapons, animals, and people. Empire was expensive, and maintaining it demanded careful planning. Egypt did not rely on force alone. One of the most revealing sources from this period is a collection of diplomatic letters written on clay tablets. These letters show rulers across the eastern Mediterranean addressing the Egyptian king as an equal, exchanging gifts, proposing marriages, and negotiating alliances. Gold, grain, horses, and luxury goods moved across borders. Power was expressed as much through relationships as through battles. The wealth that flowed into Egypt during this time was immense. Temples grew larger and more elaborate. Cities expanded. Royal courts became centers of luxury, filled with imported goods and skilled artisans. Priests gained influence as temples accumulated land and resources. Religion and empire became tightly linked, each supporting the other. But this prosperity came with tension. As temples and officials grew richer, the king's direct control faced new challenges. Managing distant territories required delegation, and delegation always carried risk. Some regions were loyal, others resisted quietly. Rebellions had to be put down. Garrisons had to be reinforced. The image of endless victory carved into stone often hid a reality of constant effort. There is also debate about how empire affected ordinary Egyptians. Some benefited from trade and state projects. Others bore the burden of taxes and labor demands. Records suggest that while the elite prospered, inequality remained. The success of empire did not erase social strain. It sometimes increased it. What defines the new kingdom is not just its power, but its balance. Egypt stood at the center of a connected world, managing war and diplomacy at the same time. It was strong, admired, and feared, but never entirely secure. In the next part, we will look more closely at how this global role reshaped Egyptian identity, belief, and daily life, and where the cracks in this powerful system began to show. Chapter 8. Religious Revolution and its Aftermath. In the middle of Egypt's imperial age, when temples were rich and the gods were many, something happened that had no real precedent in Egyptian history. A single ruler attempted to reshape belief itself, not by adding a new god, and not by favoring one temple over another, but by narrowing the entire religious world down to one divine force. This moment, centered in the 14th century BC, would become one of the most controversial and least understood episodes in ancient Egypt. The change is usually associated with a king who came to the throne during a time of great wealth and stability. At first, there was little sign of disruption. Temples still functioned. Priests still held influence. But gradually, royal art and inscriptions began to shift. The sun god, once one among many, was now shown as the sole source of life. Other gods faded from official imagery. Their names appeared less often. Then, in some places, they vanished entirely. What makes this period so difficult to study is how deliberately it was later erased. After this king's death, his successors worked to undo almost every trace of the experiment. Temples were dismantled. Names were chiseled away. Statues were broken or reused. Even the city built to support the new belief system was abandoned and left to crumble. What survives today is fragmented, uneven, and often damaged by design. Archaeology gives us our clearest clues. Art from this period looks different from anything before or after it. Figures are shown with softer forms, more movement, and less rigid posture. The royal family appears in intimate scenes, bathed in sunlight, receiving life directly from the solar disk above. This art was not just aesthetic, it carried a message. Power, life, and truth flowed from a single source, and the king stood closest to it. A new city was built quickly in a remote stretch of land, away from older religious centers. It was planned, organized, and populated within a short time. Houses, workshops, and temples rose together. This suggests strong central direction. But it also raises questions. How many people truly believed in this new system, and how many simply followed orders? The lack of personal religious texts from ordinary people makes this almost impossible to answer. What we do know is that the reform disrupted long-standing institutions. Temples dedicated to traditional gods lost income and influence. Priests who had once played key roles in society were pushed aside. Religious festivals that connected communities to the calendar and the land were altered or removed. For a civilization where belief was woven into daily life, this was not a small adjustment. It touched everything. The experiment did not last long. Within a generation, the system collapsed. Traditional gods returned. Old temples were restored. The new city was deserted. Later rulers presented this period as a dangerous mistake, a time when balance had been broken. By controlling the story, they controlled the lesson. Unity required tradition, not radical change. Yet the speed of both the reform and its reversal continues to puzzle historians. Some see it as a genuine spiritual movement led from the top. Others view it as a political strategy to weaken powerful religious institutions. Without unbiased written records, the truth remains blurred. What is clear is that this moment exposed something fragile beneath Egypt's stability. Belief could be reshaped, but only so far. In the next part, we will look at how the aftermath of this revolution affected Egypt's sense of order, memory, and authority long after the temples were rebuilt. Chapter 9. Slow Decline and Foreign Shadows. After the religious experiment was erased and older traditions restored, Egypt did not suddenly return to the confidence of its earlier imperial days. On the surface, temples reopened, gods regained their names, and royal imagery returned to familiar forms. But underneath that appearance of continuity, something had shifted. The new kingdom moved forward, yet it did so carrying quiet weaknesses that would grow over time. The decline that followed was not dramatic or immediate. It was slow, uneven, and shaped as much by outside pressure as by internal strain. One of the first signs was political exhaustion. Maintaining a vast empire had required constant military campaigns, diplomacy, and resources. Over generations, this took a toll. Borders became harder to defend. Garrisons far from the Nile demanded supplies and loyalty. Rebellions in distant territories became more frequent, not because Egypt suddenly grew weak, but because holding power at such a scale was difficult to sustain. At the same time, the balance between the king and powerful institutions began to shift. Temples, especially those dedicated to major gods, accumulated enormous wealth. They owned land, controlled labor, and managed large portions of the economy. Priests gained influence that sometimes rivaled royal authority. While this system helped stabilize religious life after the recent upheaval, it also meant that power was no longer concentrated at the center. Economic pressure added another layer of strain. Records from later in the New Kingdom show delays in payments to workers and officials. In one well-known case, laborers responsible for royal tomb construction stopped working because food deliveries failed to arrive on time. This was not a minor disruption. It showed that even core state functions were becoming harder to manage. When systems built on surplus begin to falter, trust erodes quickly. Foreign influence also increased during this period, but not always through invasion. Trade networks expanded, bringing new goods and ideas into Egypt. At the same time, neighboring powers grew stronger. Egypt was no longer the unchallenged force it had once been. Diplomatic relationships became more cautious. Marriages, treaties, and shifting alliances reflected a world where Egypt was one power among several, not the central anchor. In some regions, local leaders gained more autonomy. They managed land, settled disputes, and oversaw religious life with limited oversight from the capital. This was not outright rebellion. It was adaptation. As central control weakened, local systems filled the gaps. Egypt continued to function, but as a collection of semi-independent regions rather than a tightly unified state. What makes this period difficult to define is that decline did not feel like collapse to those living through it. Temples were still active, rituals continued, art was still produced, but the energy that once pushed Egypt outward had faded. The focus turned inward toward preserving tradition rather than expanding influence. Foreign rulers would eventually take advantage of this situation, but they did not create it. They stepped into spaces that had already opened. Later generations would remember this era as one of loss and shadow, but archaeology shows continuity alongside decline. Egypt was changing, not disappearing. In the next part, we will follow how these internal weaknesses and external pressures finally reshaped political control itself, and how Egypt entered a new phase defined by foreign rule without cultural erasure. Chapter 10. The End of Pharaohs, not of Egypt. By the time Egypt reached the final centuries of pharaonic rule, the world around it had changed beyond recognition. New powers rose across the Mediterranean and the Near East, linked by trade, war, and diplomacy on a scale Egypt had never faced before. Yet inside the Nile Valley, daily life still followed ancient rhythms. Fields were planted and harvested. Temples carried out rituals that had existed for thousands of years. To the people living there, Egypt did not feel like a civilization approaching an ending. It felt like one adapting. Again. Political control, however, was no longer fully Egyptian. Over time, foreign rulers came not just as raiders or rivals, but as administrators. Some ruled through Egyptian customs, adopting local titles, worshipping local gods, and presenting themselves in traditional forms. Others imposed new systems while allowing temples and traditions to continue. This created a strange balance. Power changed hands, but identity endured. During these centuries, Egypt became deeply entangled in the politics of the wider Mediterranean world. Greek cities, rising kingdoms, and later a growing Western power all saw Egypt as valuable, rich in grain, strategically placed, and symbolically powerful. Control of Egypt meant control of resources and prestige. As a result, Egyptian rulers were increasingly drawn into alliances and conflicts that originated far beyond the Nile. What makes this period difficult to summarize is how gradual the transition was. There was no single moment when the last pharaoh was widely recognized as such. Titles continued. Rituals continued. Even foreign rulers were depicted in traditional poses on temple walls. The image of the pharaoh survived, even as real authority shifted behind it. Coins, inscriptions, and architecture from this era show a blending of styles. Egyptian symbols appeared alongside foreign ones. New cities were built using unfamiliar layouts, while ancient religious centers remained active. This was not cultural collapse, it was layering. Egypt absorbed outside influence the way it always had, reshaping it within familiar forms. Eventually, political independence faded completely. Egypt became a province within a much larger empire. From a modern perspective, this moment is often framed as the end of ancient Egypt. But for those living through it, life did not stop. Temples remained open for centuries. Priests continued to recite hymns written in ancient language. The gods were still honored. The land still followed the Nile. What truly ended was not Egypt itself, but a specific way of ruling it. The idea of a native divine king who stood at the center of the universe could no longer survive in a world governed by distant capitals and imperial systems. Administration replaced divinity. Law replaced ritual authority. Power became abstract. And yet, Egypt's influence did not vanish. Its symbols, ideas, and religious concepts spread far beyond its borders. Later cultures studied its temples, adapted its gods, and borrowed its sense of sacred space. Even after political control was lost, Egypt remained present in memory and imagination. The end of the pharaohs was not a collapse into silence. It was a closing chapter in a long story of adaptation. Egypt had survived climate shifts, internal collapse, foreign rule, and ideological revolution. This final transition was another transformation, not an erasure. In the next part, we will reflect on what this ending truly means and why Egypt's ancient legacy continued to shape the world long after its rulers were gone.